Hello and welcome. In today's video we're going to delve into one of the most frequently asked questions in all of human history. Is there a God? There are an almost limitless number of perspectives, ideas and arguments both for and against the existence of a deity of some kind. And this video isn't actually an attempt to answer the question definitively one way or the other, the question of whether a God exists, because at the moment there is no such answer that we humans are aware of, not in any sort of meaningful sense. So instead we will be examining one of the most famous and enduring arguments in philosophy and theology, the ontological argument for the existence of God. This argument is unique in that it seeks to prove God's existence through reason alone, without reference to any sort of physical evidence or observation. Instead, it uses a purely sort of conceptual analysis to argue that God's very nature requires his existence. And this argument has fascinated and indeed frustrated philosophers for centuries, and I think you'll see why as we sort of unpack it. So we will start with Saint Anselm's formulation. So the ontological argument originated with Saint Anselm of Canterbury, who was a Benedictine monk and philosopher. And he first formulated his idea in 1078. Yes, 1078. And Anselm sought to establish an argument that would not merely sort of assert God's existence, but also make it logically inescapable. Anselm defined God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. This definition is foundational. Anselm didn't just see God as the most powerful or knowledgeable being, he saw God as the absolute maximum of greatness, embodying all conceivable perfections. For Anselm, greatness meant not just strength, wisdom, or benevolence, but a totality of perfections beyond any limitation. Anselm reasoned that if God is the greatest conceivable being, then God cannot exist only as an idea in our minds. Why? Because a being that exists in reality is greater than one that exists merely in thought. He writes, "And surely that than which greater cannot be conceived cannot be in the understanding alone. For if it is at least in the understanding alone, it can also be thought to exist in reality, which is greater." So if we define God as the greatest conceivable being, then God must exist in reality, because existing in reality would be part of what makes God maximally great. If God only existed as a concept, he would fall short of being the greatest conceivable being, which contradicts its original or our original definition. The implication here is that God's existence is not one of just of possibility, but also necessity. God must exist by virtue of his nature. Anselm argues that for God, existence is not optional, not contingent. God's very essence includes existence. He is a necessary being, and his non-existence is impossible. Now, Anselm's argument isn't simply a logical exercise. For him, it's an expression of faith-seeking understanding. He hoped that believers, by contemplating the logical structure of God's greatness, would gain a deeper appreciation of the divine. In Anselm's view, this isn't just about proving God to others, but about deepening one's own faith through reason. Anselm's argument, as elegant as it was, quickly attracted criticism, even from his contemporaries. One of his critics was a monk called Gaunilo, who responded in a piece called On Behalf of the Fool. Gaunilo's critique is now really quite famous, and it goes like this. Suppose someone claimed that somewhere in the ocean there exists a lost island, the most perfect island imaginable. This island would have every desirable quality, beauty, wealth, and comfort, and so on. If we follow Anselm's reasoning, this perfect island must exist because an island that exists in reality would be greater than an island that exists only in the imagination. Gaunilo argues that this conclusion is absurd. Defining an island as perfect doesn't make it real. For Gaunilo, Anselm's logic seems to imply that we can define anything into existence as long as we label it perfect. Gaunilo's critique raises a fundamental question. Can our concepts really dictate reality? Anselm responded to Gaunilo by arguing that his logic applies only to God. God, unlike an island, is a necessary being, meaning he must exist by definition, while an island is a contingent concept and could exist or not. Anselm writes, but surely when it is said that something that which a greater cannot be thought to exist, it is not understood to be something of this kind, like a real or an imaginary island. However, critics point out that Anselm's reply might be begging the question. It assumes God's necessary existence without proving it. This brings us to the crux of Gaunilo's critique. Where does the idea of necessary existence actually apply to anything, even to God? Or is it just a theological assumption? So now we are going to have a quick look at Descartes, who had some things to say the least. So centuries after Anselm and Gaunilo, the French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes offered his own version of the ontological argument in Meditations on First Philosophy. Descartes, like Anselm, aimed to establish God's existence as logically certain. Descartes argued that that existence is a perfection, a quality that completes or enhances a being. In Descartes' words, but if the mere fact that I can draw the idea of a triangle from my thought does not make me conclude that any triangle exists in the world, it is certainly different for God. To Descartes, existence is a necessary attribute of a supremely perfect being. Just as having three sides is essential to the nature of the triangle. A perfect being lacking existence, he argued, would be imperfect. Descartes also believed that the idea of God is innate, implanted in our minds by God himself. However, critics, most notably David Hume, argued that that existence cannot be deducted from concepts alone. Hume writes, there is an evident absurdity in pretending to demonstrate a matter or fact, or to prove it by any arguments a priori. For Hume, existence is an empirical matter, not something that should be proven by logic alone. For him, all claims of existence must be based on observation, not reading. Not reasoning. I don't know why I said reading there. Meant reasoning. So, perhaps the most famous critique of the ontological argument comes from Immanuel Kant. In his Critique of Pure Reason, which, if you haven't read it, it's a tough thing to read, but it's incredible, Kant argued that existence is not a predicate. By this, he meant that existence does not add anything to the concept of a being. Kant illustrated this with his example of 100 thalers, type of currency. He explained that 100 real thalers do not contain the least coin more than 100 possible thalers. So in other words, the concept of 100 thalers doesn't change if they actually exist. Existence doesn't add to their value or their attributes. For Kant, predicates add something to a concept, like size, colour or shape. But existence simply affirms that the concept has a real-world counterpart. And this means that adding existence to the concept of God doesn't make God greater. It only affirms that God exists, which is what the ontological argument is trying to prove in the first place. Kant also challenged the very idea of necessary existence. For him, necessity applies to logical truths like mathematical concepts, but not to matters of existence in the real world. Kant argues that the ontological argument confuses logical necessity with existential necessity, which cannot be proven by reason alone. So now, in sort of more recent times, Alvin Plantinga reformulated the ontological argument using modal logic. His version, which is found in the Nature of Necessity, focuses on possible worlds, which are hypothetical realities. Alvin's argument suggests that if it's possible for a maximally great being to exist, then such a being must exist in every possible world, including our own. In Alvin's argument, God is defined as a maximally great being who possesses all great-making properties, omnipotence, omniscience, moral perfection, and so on, and who exists necessarily. If such a being exists in any possible world, Alvin argues, he must exist in all possible worlds because maximal greatness includes necessary existence. But this argument also faces critiques. Some philosophers question whether the concept of maximal greatness is coherent, arguing that omnipotence and omniscience might contradict each other. Others, like J.L. Mackie, argue that possible worlds are merely conceptual and don't necessarily imply actual existence. Mackie writes, If God's existence is contingent on the logical possibilities of other worlds, then the argument fails to establish actual existence. The ontological argument raises profound questions about the nature of existence. Can we reason our way to the existence of a being, or is existence fundamentally empirical? The argument challenges us to consider whether existence is a great-making property or simply a state of actuality. Kant's critique, especially, out of all the ones we've sort of covered, it really does press this question, as it challenges the idea that existence is something that can be that can sort of like enhance a being. For Kant, existence is either real or conceptual, but it's not a feature that adds to greatness. This leaves us with a central question. Does existence belong to reality, or is it simply a condition? The ontological argument thus continues to be a test case in philosophy, challenging our understanding of logic, existence, and the nature of God. The ontological argument has remained central in philosophy and theology for over 1,000 years. It is a remarkable intellectual endeavour that stretches our understanding of reality and the limits of thought. Anselm, Descartes, and Plantinga each sought to prove God's existence by defining him in such a way that non-existence would be contradictory. Their critics, from from Gaunilo to Kant to Hume, remind us that the boundary between concept and reality may be less clear than what we'd like to believe. Ultimately, whether or not you find the ontological argument convincing, it remains one of the most thought-provoking arguments in philosophy, inviting us to grapple with the deepest questions about existence, reason, and the divine. So that's a look at the ontological argument for the existence of God and the different ways that argument has been sort of presented and manipulated and so on. And there are there's lots to be learned from it, even if we never actually get to some sort of conclusive answer about the existence of God, the existence of the arguments and so on. At the very least, tests and expands our capacity to conceive possibility. So if you found this video interesting and informative, then please do all the YouTube things, like the videos, subscribe to the channel and so on. There is no pressure to do so, but it would be appreciated. But also it will mean that YouTube will show you obviously more of my stuff, but perhaps more importantly, it will show you a range of other people talking about similar topics, which in turn will help to expand your knowledge and the perceptions of that knowledge and so on. So thank you very much for watching and listening. As I say, I hope you found it interesting, and yeah, I very much look forward to seeing you on the next one. So thank you very much. Goodbye.